reason why you hear sad music is because today we are going to study about all of the life of all of the ships I know. My favorite vessel we are going to start with, Aquitania. Aquitania was a 1913 liner built for Cunard Line. Aquitania had a service speed of 24 to 26 knots. At least the highest speed she reached was at least 28 knots. She had probably at least two turbines or one turbine. I'm never sure if on four-bladed liners if it exactly had four turbines. It's possible Aquitania had four turbines. Aquitania had a crew capacity of 972 plus 3,230 accommodated passengers, which led to a capacity of at least 4,000 something. Aquitania was one of the first vessels to carry enough lifeboats for all passengers. Aquitania was the first for 1914, at least to carry enough for all passengers on board. She just had a little less than 80 lifeboats, or maybe in the 80s of lifeboats. Aquitania had 60,000 about horsepower created from turbines and triple expansion engines. I'm never sure if I'm right, but correct me in the comments. Aquitania then moved on to 1914 until one of her rivals would come along to life, Britannic. Britannic then was refitted for war. Through Aquitania was then refitted, but due to a storm, Aquitania was destroyed when she was a hospital ship. She was destroyed in a storm, but did not sink. She was pulled to dock to get repaired. So instead, Britannic sailed for the Mediterranean and ultimately struck a mine during the voyage. That would have been Aquitania's fate. That almost would have been Aquitania's fate if it was not destroyed by the storm. It would almost be Aquitania's end, just probably by at least 3 years of life, at least from being launched in 1913. And Britannic sank, and then minutes later, Britannic sank 55 minutes on November 16th, 1916. Aquitania was first turned into a troop ship and carried guns so she could destroy enemies like Olympic did. Since Olympic was then the older than all the sister ships, because Olympic and Aquitania were both turned into troop ships before going into hospital service. Aquitania was put in hospital service, but Olympic served troop service throughout her entire war career. Mauretania was ultimately turned into a hospital ship, but Aquitania was just first. Probably they are both troop ships first, and then they were both converted into hospital ships. And then through 1917, they were refitted. After that, they were refitted into a hospital ship for legal protections. And it means for dazzling, you could sink them freely, but hospital protection, you cannot sink them. And when they sank Britannic, they did something illegal. And then they moved on through 1917 and 1918. And then after the war, they were converted. Aquitania was converted back to liner service, so as Mauretania. Although Aquitania lost her running mate Lusitania during the war a year before Britannic, she was replaced with the massive German liner Imperator. She was then renamed Berengaria and was a 906 long liner that could carry up to 4,234 passengers and a crew of 1,180, which led to a capacity of at least 5,210. then we have Aquitania and Mauretania throughout 1929. Nothing really occurred really bad until in 1930, Mauretania was converted into a cruise liner. Aquitania still continued with liner service. In Olympic was also in liner service with all of her other sisters gone. Olympic was then turned into a cruise ship probably in 1934 when Wilhelm Gustloff and 2 years after Mauretania was converted into a cruise liner. This construction of the Wilhelm Gustloff began. Throughout 1933 and 1934, Queen Mary's began. Took 2 years, but Wilhelm Gustloff took at least 4 years to complete it. Somehow, Queen Mary is bigger, but somehow they completed Queen Mary before Wilhelm Gustloff. We're not sure if Queen Mary is older than Wilhelm Gustloff, but we are back to Aquitania and Olympic and Mauretania. And then Aquitania still continued with liner service throughout, with Mauretania with cruise liner as again. Olympic in 1934 was yet turned into a cruise liner. Throughout 1935, Olympic and Mauretania sailed on their last voyage, but they were not immediately after that last voyage scrapped. Since Mauretania and Olympic were the oldest, since Mauretania was built in 1904 and being finished in 1907, an Olympic being built in 1911, probably launched in 1911 that same year. The construction would be progressed from at least 1909 to 1911. And then throughout that, Olympic and Mauretania were scrapped. All it was, there was other liners were also taken out of service. Majestic, Homeric, and Mauretania and Olympic and others were taken out of service, since Cunard Line and White Star had other ships. But then in 1935, the Majestic lasted 4 more years after Olympic and Mauretania and Homeric were scrapped. Majestic ultimately caught on fire and then was scrapped in 1940. Then we only just have Aquitania continuing. Aquitania was then turned into another troop ship during the Second World War. When she was sailing out of a dock in New Zealand, I think, a mine layer laid mines in the port, so the ships sailing out of the port would be sunk. But Aquitania in particular was not sunk. The death traps waiting below Aquitania did not hit them. Aquitania escaped death there. In 1941, she was all okay through 1942, 1943, 1944, 1945, until a very absolutely tragic day happened for Aquitania, like again when she lost her mate Mauretania in 1935. Like SS France was lost and sunk since she collided with another ship in 1935 and ultimately sunk. That was the SS France 1910 version. And again in 1945, January 30th, Wilhelm Gustloff was ultimately torpedoed 3 times and then sunk, killing 9,400 lives. It was a big blow with Aquitania. Although Wilhelm Gustloff was German, it was a big blow for Aquitania and the British ships and German ships. it would be a larger blow for German ships, dude. It was also a German ship. And Aquitania was then in 1946 turned into a cruise liner, and then 1947, 1948, 1949, Aquitania throughout after the war, she carried Canada civilians, and then in 1947 she was turned into a cruise ship, and throughout 1948 she only served at least 1 year in cruise service. And then in 1949, Aquitania was then turned back into a passenger ship and went on her very last voyage. And she went on her last voyage and then pulled to Faslane, Scotland, and scrapped. Very sad ending. Number 2. It was probably Carpathia or something. Carpathia was a liner built in 1900. Throughout time, a smaller liner named SS Californian was construction only for 1 year. Then Carpathia was just larger by 100-something feet, which led to a 3-year longer construction than 3-year construction of Carpathia. Carpathia then was finished by 1903. She was then launched throughout fitting out. She was fitted out, but some larger liners were already merged that were older and were bigger, like RMS Oceanic II was launched in 1899 and was 704 feet, compared to Carpathia's little 558 feet, and a max of at least 13 knots. Carpathia then knew it would definitely, but the older ships than Carpathia that were bigger then noticed they would lose, because then in 1904, Lusitania was being constructed, and Lusitania was a staggering 787 feet, making Lusitania largest in the world. Throughout time, in 1906, Lusitania was then launched. Carpathia was just fine throughout 1907, until she definitely knew she would absolutely lose. But Lusitania was no longer the largest. Mauretania, her sister ship to Lusitania, Mauretania, was then launched and was 2 feet larger than Lusitania. Carpathia was lose against size. And then throughout 1908, Lusitania made her maiden voyage. Also Mauretania did. In 1909, Olympic definitely began, and Carpathia was a definitely lose. Because Olympic was 883 feet, there's no larger ship. Until in 1911, Olympic was then launched actually. Then a day later, Titanic was bigger, even bigger than Carpathia. Then 1 year later, Aquitania then came along. And then Britannic came along. Aquitania would be the largest right now, but only for the SS Imperator in 1912 would be larger than Aquitania, making Imperator the largest now. And throughout 1914, the war broke out, and then nothing happened to Carpathia. Maybe only war service happened for her. I am never sure if war service happened for Carpathia. Carpathia continued with passenger service even throughout the war. 1914, 1915, when Lusitania ultimately was struck by a torpedo and sunk in 18 minutes. Then throughout 1916, Britannic then sunk, and then Carpathia was feeling really bad. As for Carpathia rescued Titanic in 1912. She sailed on for 1917 in 1 more year. And then Carpathia did have sister ships. The Saxonia, that was older than Carpathia. And in Vera, I think what it was called. Ultimately, a year before Carpathia was sunk, her sister ship in Venera was sunk, torpedoed and sunk. Then a year later, Carpathia would be sunk. Then Saxonia was still just carrying on, until sadly in 1925, Saxonia was then scrapped. So my next one, although it was one of the 19th, SS Edmund Fitzgerald. SS Edmund Fitzgerald was launched in order for 1956 when the Italian liner Andrea Doria was sunk just in 1956. Throughout when a captain named Peterson ordered Edmund Fitzgerald to be constructed. Throughout 1957, the SS United States was a total, absolute loss for the Edmund Fitzgerald. Edmund Fitzgerald was some 200 feet less than SS United States length. Edmund Fitzgerald had her construction throughout 1957 and completed in 1958, and then the rest of the fitting out process happened, and then before being launched. Then in 1958, June 7th, Edmund Fitzgerald was launched. One person was killed during it. How? A man named, I forgot his name throughout time, but after a large wave at a wrong angle, the man was scared by it, and ultimately had a heart attack and died. And that was really harsh for Edmund Fitzgerald to be launched and killed someone. And then throughout 1959, she was fitted out and made her maiden voyage. And then 1 year later, Edmund Fitzgerald was not alone, because 1 year later after her maiden voyage, the Arthur B. Homer was her sister ship. Arthur B. Homer was a little bit smaller than Edmund Fitzgerald by at least 18 feet, because Edmund Fitzgerald had an additional 729 feet. Arthur B. Homer had an additional 711 feet. Edmund Fitzgerald was, though, launched in 1958. Arthur B. Homer came in 1960 and then was fitted out to be launched. Arthur B. Homer was then launched probably in 1962. And Edmund Fitzgerald, then at least 4 years after Arthur B. Homer's launch, a really, really old cargo ship named SS Daniel J. Morrell was a 60-year-old cargo ship that was at least 608 feet in length. The Daniel J. Morrell had a lifespan of at least 60 years, from 1906 all the way to 1966. And Daniel J. Morrell had the same fate as Carl D. Bradley did in 1958. Carl D. Bradley had the similar fate to the Daniel J. Morrell. Daniel J. Morrell had the same fate as Carl D. Bradley in 1958. And then a decade later after Bradley, throughout 1966, 1967, 1968, Edmund Fitzgerald was the largest, but in 1980 she had then lost the title of largest ship on the lakes. And then throughout in 1970 she lost her largest ship title. And then 1971 she did definitely lose that title. Edmund Fitzgerald then carried on to in 1970, Edmund Fitzgerald got a new captain, I know better than Peterson, Ernest McSorley. Ernest McSorley would only keep on with Edmund Fitzgerald for the next 5 years of Edmund Fitzgerald's life. Edmund Fitzgerald only had an 18-year life. And Edmund Fitzgerald sailed on for 5 more years and would have the same fate as Carl D. Bradley and Daniel J. Morrell. Edmund Fitzgerald, in a horrible storm, after loading a last load of taconite pellets before she would go into a break, Edmund Fitzgerald then suddenly sunk immediately in just 4 seconds. No one survived throughout time, and no bodies were found until 1990. One body was discovered right by the bow on the other side, and people were wondering how that guy got outside of the ship. And you cannot go inside Edmund Fitzgerald, because Edmund Fitzgerald is actually ultimately haunted. There are actually ghosts. All hands were lost. Then a year later, after the sinking, one day later after the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald, an airplane scanner scanned the Great Lakes and then found 2 large pieces settling on the seafloor at least 530 feet of water. And then they concluded it might be the Fitzgerald. Then a day later, they actually concluded it was the Edmund Fitzgerald. It was actually the ship, and it was discovered. And Arthur B. Homer still carried on after that. Arthur B. Homer then was scrapped in 1985. My next one is Queen Mary. The next one is Queen Mary. Queen Mary began her construction, as you all know, in 1934, because it was mentioned during the Aquitania story. Then Queen Mary was then launched in 1936. She was intended to be the largest ship in the world, but because of the French liner SS Normandy was a broadcast 10 feet bigger than Queen Mary, making Queen Mary not yet make that title. Throughout time, Queen Mary never won that title. But throughout speed, Aquitania and Normandy, because Normandy's size, they began a rivalry. And for 14 years, Queen Mary kept that blue ribbon. The rivalry carried on until World War II. In 1948, in 1940, Queen Mary was converted into a troop ship. In the war, Normandy sailed one more passenger. The Normandy sailed one more passenger sail until 1940. The Normandy was converted into a troop ship, as Queen Mary was next to Normandy. But Normandy, while work, they turned off the fire attempts thing, or whatever it's called. And they turned it off, which caused a fire from a spark and a torch. A man was accidentally used a torch and accidentally set the ship on fire at the stern. Normandy then burned and capsized overnight. And Queen Mary was carried on. In 1941, nothing really happened. But it's sometime during the war. I can't remember when it happened, but in World War II, when Queen Mary was... there's one thing I forgot to mention in the Aquitania story. Aquitania then collided with this little destroyer named USS Shaw, and Aquitania sunk the Shaw. But now we're going back to Queen Mary. That's one thing I forgot to tell you in Aquitania story. So, and then Queen Mary during the war in World War II, Queen Mary was sailing probably alone or in a convoy until Queen Mary spotted a German U-boat. Queen Mary sailed in a zigzag so she could not attempt to be killed during the war. And then she ultimately rammed the U-boat. She still was the fastest ship in the world throughout 1945 until the big blow of the Wilhelm Gustloff went off, and was a big one for Queen Mary. The same as for Aquitania, I would mention the same thing. Throughout 1950, then Aquitania was scrapped. And then in 1951, the Queen Mary would lose the title to Blue Ribbon after the SS United States captured the ribbon. Because the SS United States was some 30 tons less than Queen Mary's tonnage. Okay. And SS United States took on Queen Mary's record and hold it for the rest of the liner's service time. Because SS United States had provincial speeds that were not supposed to be let out. SS United States could reach speeds up at least 42 knots, 39 knots, but the actual speeds were 42 to 50 knots of the SS United States, definitely killing off Queen Mary. In 1967, Queen Mary was then retired, but Queen Elizabeth, her running mate, Queen Mary's running mate, Queen Elizabeth, carried on for at least until 1972, until Queen Elizabeth then caught on fire and then capsized. And then in 1975, 3 years, Queen Elizabeth was scrapped because in the harbor, in Hong Kong harbor, or the place where she did sink, is because they did not want ships to collide with the wreck, so they rather just scrapped the wreck. I hope you enjoyed this video. I will make a part 2 tomorrow. This was the first one. Tomorrow we are going to study about 3 more ships. Again. Wait. Yeah, 3 more ships. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to leave a like and comment below and subscribe. I would really love it. Bye.